What's up guys, Lon here from Android Authority, and this is the Nubia Z11. It's been out for a while now in other regions like China, but it's coming to the States to compete with other flagship Android phones. What does this phone do differently from the myriad of other high-end Android flagships that make this phone worth buying? Let's find out with the Nubia Z11. So the Nubia Z11 doesn't have the most eye-catching or original design, but it is a pretty good looking phone with solid build quality. It's an all-metal unibody rectangular slab that's really thin at 7.5 millimeters, feels great in the hands, and puts its build quality on par with a lot of other flagships. It's got rounded corners and slight tapers around the back and sides, which make it more comfortable to hold, but because it's bare aluminum and there aren't any sharp or flat edges to help with the grip, the phone can be a little slippery and tough to hold onto at times. Because this is a Nubia phone, you'll notice some red accents on the phone like the ring around the camera lens and the bright red capacitive keys along the bottom of the display to make the phone stand out a little more. The Z11 also comes in a black and gold color if you want something a little more flashy over the standard silver and gray, and personally I think this color option looks much nicer and makes the phone look a little bit more unique. Going around the device, you've got the power button and volume rocker on the right side, which are also made of metal, so they're very clicky and tactile, and they're positioned well enough that they're easy to reach and press with your thumb. On the left side is the SIM card slot that also houses a micro SD card slot for expandable storage, and on top you have the headphone jack and an IR blaster, which can be really convenient for controlling your TV and other peripherals, especially considering a lot of phones nowadays don't have this feature. Finally, on the bottom you have the USB Type-C port and what looks like dual speakers, but only the right side houses a speaker while the other is just a microphone. The speaker sounds fine and doesn't get distorted or tinny at all at max volume, but it's a little on the quiet side, and at half volume or less it becomes pretty tough to hear. On the back of the phone you also have a fingerprint sensor, which has worked extremely well. It's fast, accurate, takes very little time to set up, and I've had no issues with it. It's been very reliable and rarely has it ever misread my fingerprint, so it's definitely on par with some of the best fingerprint sensors on the market. One of the most eye-catching parts about the Z11 is the display. It's a 5.5-inch LCD display, but instead of Quad HD like most high-end flagships, the Z11's display is actually 1080p. It's very bright, has very saturated colors, good viewing angles, and it still looks plenty sharp that web browsing, playing games, and watching YouTube is not an issue whatsoever. So unless you're using this phone for VR, you're not going to be able to notice any difference. What makes the screen stand out though is that it's basically bezel-less on the left and right sides, and part of the reason why Nubia has been able to achieve this bezel-less look is by curving down the sides of the display. If you've used other Nubia phones in the past, you're probably used to seeing this, but it's still really impressive to look at simply because we haven't seen this from many other phone manufacturers, and it really feels like you're holding just a screen in your hands. Because the side bezels are so thin, it also makes this phone feel a lot smaller and more compact in comparison to other 5.5-inch smartphones. The curves on the sides of the screen aren't as drastic as what you might find on the S7 Edge or Note 7, but that didn't stop Nubia from adding some additional software tweaks to take advantage of the super thin side bezels. You can do a variety of different things like adjust the screen's brightness by sliding 2 fingers up and down along the edges of the display, swipe up or down from the edge to switch between apps that you have running in the background, swipe repeatedly from the edge to close all recent apps, and hold along the edge and swipe inwards to quickly switch to a specific home screen. They all sound really useful but can be a little awkward to use, and some of them aren't that much faster than doing things the traditional way. I also ran into a lot of issues with accidentally triggering these features from just holding the phone, but fortunately all these features can be disabled if you run into the same problems or don't find them all that useful. Inside, it's got the typical specs for a 2016 flagship. You have the Snapdragon 820, 4 gigs of RAM, and 64 gigs of internal storage, and if you opt for the higher end black and gold model, this actually comes with 6 gigabytes of RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage. While I can't comment on what performance is like on the 6 gigabyte model, performance has been perfectly fine on the 4 gigs of RAM version. Even with Nubia's very heavy skin, it's been very fast in day-to-day use from launching apps, web browsing, watching videos, and playing a lot of graphically intensive games. It does all those things without much of a problem, with the only exception being multitasking. The multitasking experience on this phone feels very slow and clunky. There's no recent apps key, so instead you have to long press the back key to get to your recent apps, and the loading of the recent apps usually takes a good couple of seconds. The apps are also laid out in a horizontal view, allowing you to only see a couple apps at a time, and swiping back and forth to switch between apps is a much slower experience in comparison to something like the card stack layout from stock Android. As far as battery life goes, it's nothing out of the ordinary. It's got a 3000 milliamp hour battery, and Nubia says their battery optimizations will allow you to get 2 days worth of battery, but in my experience, it never lasted more than just a typical day's worth of use. With texting, social media, email, web browsing, and a couple hours of YouTube and gaming per day, the phone usually lasted between 12 to 13 hours off the charger, which is far from Nubia's 2-day claim, but it was always good enough to get me comfortably through a day. And yes, of course, with this being a flagship and running the Snapdragon 820, it does come with Quick Charge 3.0 to make it really fast and easy to get this phone back up and running. The camera isn't rocking any fancy dual lens setup that we've been starting to see on a lot of other smartphones, but it is packing some rather interesting features. The front camera is an 8 megapixel lens, and if you're into taking selfies, it is definitely more than good enough to do that. The rear camera comes in at 16 megapixels with f2.0 aperture, optical image stabilization, and phase detection autofocus. The camera app is straightforward and easy to use, but it does look very iOS-like. You can swipe left or right to switch between different camera modes, and there are some modes built into this camera that make it unique and fun to use. For example, there's a clone mode that will overlap several photos to make it appear as if there are multiples of a person or object in one photo, and for the most part, it does a pretty good job of stitching these photos together, but it isn't always perfect. Another interesting mode on the Z11 is called electronic aperture, and this mode lets you dial in an aperture from as wide as f2.8 to as narrow as f44. Changing the aperture will effectively change the shutter speed from as little as 0.3 of a second to 72 seconds long, and the longer shutter speeds will allow you to capture some very silky smooth motion blur with moving subjects while still keeping everything else that's stationary in focus. The Z11 has 3 types of stabilization built in to allow you to use this feature with just your hands, but in my experience the results were still much better with a tripod, especially if you're using shutter speeds that are over a minute long. In terms of general picture quality, it's actually quite good. The pictures that it takes are pleasantly sharp and detailed, and there's a good amount of color to make them look pleasing to the eye, but not so much that they look oversaturated or unnatural. It does, however, have the tendency to overexpose and blow out highlights, which can be alleviated by using HDR. The thing I like most about the HDR mode on this camera is that it will automatically take a standard shot and an HDR shot for you in one take, which can ultimately save you a lot of time and hassle from having to switch back and forth between HDR and standard photos. In low light, the camera does tend to focus hunt a lot, which makes the camera experience feel a lot slower, but the pictures that it takes in low light still have a relatively good amount of detail. There isn't a whole lot of graininess or noticeable noise reduction, but it still has problems with properly exposing highlights just like it does in daytime shots. It's currently running Android 6.0 Marshmallow with Nubia's UI version 4.0, which drastically changes the entire Android experience. It's filled with very bright and cartoonish looking icons, a lot of transparency effects, and there's also no app drawer, but Nubia's UI does come jam-packed with some pretty interesting features. If you long press on the fingerprint sensor or hold volume down in power, this will give you the option to take a long screenshot, which is great for web articles, a standard screenshot that you can crop into different shapes like hearts and circles, or create a screen recording. My favorite feature is actually the way this phone handles split screen multitasking. To enter split screen multitasking, all you have to do is swipe up from the bottom of the display, but instead of giving you a list of applications like you would get on other smartphones that have split screen multitasking, the Z11 splits the screen into 2 separate desktops. It's a very different approach, but by doing it this way, you're able to use virtually any application that you want. The only exception is the camera, but just because you can use any apps that you want, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should. Apps like games can open up in split screen view, but they aren't exactly split screen friendly, but apps like social media, email, text, and Chrome work just as you would expect. Pricing for the Nubia Z11 in the US is still to be determined, but in other regions it's currently going for €499 for the standard version and €599 for the black and gold edition. Hopefully these prices aren't an indication of what the US prices might be, because if they are, then the Z11 is going to be fairly expensive for an unlocked phone. But the big question here is if this phone is worth getting over other flagships. The Z11 is a good flagship phone from Nubia, but it doesn't necessarily have a ton of compelling reasons to make this phone a better option over other smartphones currently available. Had it came to the US a lot earlier in the year, it might have snagged a lot more attention, but at this point in 2016, there's a ton of great Android options at a variety of different price points, and Nubia might be a little too late to the party. As always, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed this review of the Nubia Z11. If you did, please give it a thumbs up down below and also subscribe to the channel, which is also down below if you haven't already, and follow us on social media like Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, Google+, all that good stuff will be linked down below, and feel free to follow me on Twitter as well. And as always, check out the website androidauthority.com because we are your source for all things Android.